Hello, I'm James Davis. I'm the faculty director of the Open Source Program Office at UC Santa Cruz, and I'm really pleased to be having a conversation with Heather Meeker. She's a partner at Tech Law Partners. She specializes in open source licensing. Business Insider named her one of 10 people transforming technology. She's had too many best lawyer, top lawyer kinds of awards for me to mention. And relevant to today's discussion, she's got books on how to commercialize open source software. So I'm going to let her say a few words to get us started thinking about our questions and how we're going to go. While you're getting your questions thought about after that, I'll ask you a few questions, but we'll mostly open it up to the audience to be able to ask whatever sorts of questions you have for us to have some discussion about this notion of commercial open source software.
Thank you very much. And thank you for inviting me to participate in this. So happy to see such a great turnout. Is this the inaugural event? The inaugural one of these? That's fantastic. I look forward to great things. So to give you some context, I'm a lawyer and an investor in both respects. I specialize in open source software licensing, and I've been working on it for a long time, and I'm here today to talk about how to commercialize open source software. You heard a lot about that in the last discussion, I think. I'm the tactician who gets down in the weeds and helps people figure out how to do this stuff. And I'm a lawyer, I'm at Tech Law Partners, but I'm also part of something called Chinstrap community, which I'll talk a little bit more about at the very end. So let's see here. Okay. So people come to me all the time and they say, how do you make money giving software away? I mean, that's the big question, right? And people usually, when they say this to me, they're very skeptical, right? And I've been told that I'm dating myself by using this image, but I love South Park, so who cares, right? But you might recall the South Park episode of the Underpants Gnomes. And the Underpants Gnomes, they stole people's underwear. And then when people asked them why they were stealing people's underwear, they said, well, we have a 3-phase plan. Phase 1, collect underpants. Phase 3, profit. But they couldn't explain phase 2. And often when you talk about open source, commercializing open source, that is kind of what it sounds like. And my whole role these days is to figure out phase 2 and avoid people being the underpants gnomes. So here's the thing about open source, and I'm maybe going to go forward. You're seeing here a picture of a car with all of its parts not assembled. Okay, I didn't invent this metaphor. It was created by the person who founded Red Hat Software, which is the granddaddy of all open source businesses. So the question is, would you buy this car in the form it's in? Suppose a car costs $30,000, but you could get this for $1, right? Which one would you prefer? Well, I think most of us would actually pay the $30,000 for the car. Okay, so why would we do that? Well, if we got this version of the car, if you're very smart, maybe you could put the car together, but I couldn't do it, right? Even if you did put it together, you couldn't find anyone to service it. You maybe couldn't even have it be street legal and drive it on the street, and it might not work correctly. So this is the answer to the question of how do you make money using open source, selling open source software, selling in quotation marks. When you don't sell it, you give it away, right? And the answer is that all of the businesses that commercialize open source software are adding an element of value that is like the difference between the disassembled car and the finished car. The software source code is a wonderful tool, but it is not a product. And particularly today, in the era where a lot of software is delivered as a service, it's not a product at all. So the businesses that do commercial open source software are adding something very important and valuable to the disassembled car. can go backwards, yeah. So we have a few models that are very popular. There are others, but these are most of the ones you see. First would be maintenance, support, and quality assurance. Second would be open core. Third would be dual licensing, and then there are others that are a little bit more niche areas. But the maintenance and support and QA, that's kind of it's the basic model. So a lot of people, if you talk to them about commercializing open source software, they'll say, I'm going to release the software, and then I'm going to provide maintenance and support, and that's how I'm going to make my money. And that is great if you want a salary. It's not great if you want a business, because maintenance and support is not scalable. If you want investors for a business, you will not get investments because maintenance and support is not scalable. Why? Because maintenance and support is human effort, so the more you provide, the more you have to pay for. QA is actually a little more interesting because this is actually a lot of what companies like Red Hat do. They make sure that the software works, right? And that's very important, and that's actually scalable because once you make sure it works once, you can make sure it works for a lot of people. Another model is what we call open core, and that's, if you think about products like Confluent, you have an open core, which is an open source project, and then you have a bunch of add-ons and delivery and managed services and so forth that provide value mostly for large-scale enterprise use. So that's another approach. And then dual licensing, the poster child for that is Grafana, where you offer the software under one license and then you can have people buy access to it under other licenses or as a managed service. So those are the most popular ways to get from the car, the disassembled car, to the car. And I mentioned all of these. The one I didn't mention there was WordPress. WordPress is the most popular blogging software. I run my blog on WordPress. I could, WordPress.com. I could theoretically run my own WordPress, but I don't want to, right? And so they're actually selling a great deal into small and medium enterprise because those are the people like me who don't want to be bothered with standing up their own instance on their own server. So all of these things work really well. Red Hat had an enormous exit, got sold to IBM for many billions of dollars. WordPress is private, but raking in the money. Confluent and Grafana are two of the bigger unicorns in Silicon Valley. So this works. There's no question that it works. There is an answer to the underpants gnomes question. And I'm here to talk about whatever you'd like to talk about. And I'm going to just point out before we have our little chat, a couple of things. First, I do have a book about this. If you're the kind of person who wants to read books, then take a look at From Project to Profit. This is specifically focused towards entrepreneurs who want to build a business around open source software, and also Chinstrap community. This is something that I've started with my partner Saber, who is right over there. Stand up, Saber. Yes. And so we have started a program that provides information to people who want to do commercial open source software, including a lot of information, materials, Discord server, and free workshops that you can actually sign up for. So if you're a potential founder of a company, or if you're in a university tech transfer program or OSPO, we have programs for founders and for university professors, separate tracks. Or if you're an investor, hey, talk to me at the break, right? But also for investors in this area. So these are resources that are available to you if you're interested, and we hope you will participate in our community. So that's it for my prepared comments. Did I make it under 10 minutes? Yeah, okay.
Yeah, you did.
Okay, good.
The website is chinstrap.community.
Good point.
Thank you. So I want to start by asking about, I think many open source projects start as one or a small team of people as sort of we have this need, and then they maybe grow into a community, and they didn't start out thinking we're going to commercialize. They started out in some other way. And so I'm wondering if there's important things people should be thinking about early on, decisions they might make that might help lead them to commercialization or might block them from commercialization by the choices that they made sort of early on when they weren't really at the stage they were thinking about that, things that people should know about.
Well, I heard that people were talking about this in the last panel a little bit, and in the investment world, we call this like product market fit, right? So if you are writing the software that calculates how to send, things into space, right? Maybe it isn't a big commercial, a big commercial demand for this, but you should. If you're interested in the possibility of commercialization, one of the first things you think about is who would buy the thing that I would be selling, right? And it's possible that you don't have a very big market, and in that case, you may be better going with grant funding, Linux Foundation type funding and so forth, as opposed to private capital funding. Private capital funding is for businesses that you need a little bit of capital to leverage it into a lot of sales, right? And there's nothing wrong with having a project that only scratches your own itch, of course, or that is useful to a small number of people, but I think you just have to not be the underpants nuts, like be realistic about how big a market you have. I've been working in Silicon Valley for a long, long time, and one thing that I've observed, I'm not alone in observing this, is that people who are starting companies in the tech business tend to get in love with the technology, and they think that if they have great technology, they'll have a great business. And great technology is a wonderful thing, but that does not make a great business. What makes a great business is product market fit and execution. Right? So if you're interested in starting a business, you're going to have to think about those things. And if you're the kind of person who doesn't like to think about those kinds of things, you maybe need to partner up with someone who does. It's quite common for startup businesses to have a tech person and a business person who collaborate with and use their respective skills.
So I think I want to add to this a little bit and ask the follow-on here of, do you see people that come to you that want to commercialize, but they made wrong choices earlier on? So I talk to a lot of students that are worried about this. If I choose the wrong license, are people not going to do it? If I release this piece of code versus that piece of code, then I can't commercialize later. And they're sort of worried about the choices that they're making. And they're not to that stage, right? They're not ready to come ask you for funding. They're not ready to commercialize, but they're worried about their choices. So do you see people that come thinking about funding, thinking about commercialization? They are at that stage, but somehow they mess themselves up earlier. Is that not something you see? And maybe we should tell students, don't worry about that.
Yeah, I see it all the time, but maybe not in quite the way that most people think. So if you choose a license that doesn't serve your business model, so I didn't give a long presentation about which licenses to choose for which business models and so forth. There's a lot of information, with the materials that I mentioned to you. But let's suppose you choose the wrong license in the sense that you choose, let's say, a permissive license, and then you are dismayed that people are using your software for free. Okay, so that would be unrealistic to be dismayed about because that's exactly what you authorized them to do. That can be something that can be hard to recover from. And if you look at some businesses like Elastic, like Redis and so forth, those are businesses that started out under permissive licenses, and they had to pivot and do license changes in order to serve their business models. Pivoting and doing a new license is possible, but it's a lot of work, and it also tends to disrupt your community a lot. So it's best to make a better decision up front to avoid disruption down the road. Now, the thing that I see people doing that compromises their ability to commercialize the most, absolutely number one, is failure to attend to brand management. Okay, so if you start a product a project and you call it, network software, right? You're not going to be able to protect that as brand, right? And by the time you get to commercialization, your community already knows your project as network software. So then you have to do a branding change, and that is even harder than a license change, because people already know and associate that phrase with your product. So if you want to commercialize, the one thing that is really important to do is think about what you're calling the thing that you are creating and consider whether it would be defensible as a brand name. And that's something that is, you might want to talk to a lawyer about, but there are plenty of things you can do on your own to figure it out. Like, don't call it something too generic. Don't call it something that is very close to something that already exists, because then you won't be able to protect it. So that's hard to recover from. Licensing is also hard to recover from. Both are possible, but they just take a lot of work. And if you're looking for funding from investors, and the investors realize that you're going to have to do these things, it will tend to make your company less valuable in the funding round.
So I think many people are maybe interested in building their software, and you mentioned that, okay, maybe they're going to find a partner later that's interested in the business aspect, and where are we going to get the money, and how are we going to do these things, and that's somebody else's interest. So do you see people, for most of the companies that you work with, or the ones that you've seen be successful, do you see them address these things early on, or it's so not as I was saying, that it's just like they sort of built their own project, or do you see that they sort of delay these decisions about what's going to be our business model, right? Because maybe I don't expect a software developer to make the choices about which of those business models. That's going to be something an eventual business partner is going to think about.
Yeah.
So I'm trying to figure out the sort of timing of when people figure these things out. Can you delay thinking about the business model until you are ready for that stage?
Yeah, I've seen a really broad range. Like, I've seen projects that have been going for several years before they start addressing these things, and it's not necessarily bad. But of course, it's better to try to integrate these decisions within what you're doing earlier. But with open source, the reason open source is so fantastically wonderful as the basis of a business, I don't think it's a problem for a business. I think it's great for a business, okay? Is that it is a very effective way to get people interested in your project very fast, and to get yourself known early on in your development cycle. And so in the first stages of your company, your job is to build a great project. And if you build a great project, then you have some runway to figure out your business. But you should always have it in the back of your mind so that you're not taking the wrong road, right? And so I've seen businesses, I have people come to me and say, I've been working on this for 5 years, and now I want to figure out how to make a business out of it. And that has been possible. And then I've seen people who just absolutely from day one knew they wanted to commercialize things and started planning the strategy there. But there is a certain element of you have some leeway to figure it out, but the earlier the better.
So the last thing I want to ask you about, sort of before we ask the audience for questions, is what are the sort of primary things you see that make a project investable, and is it different in the open source space than it is in the sort of standard Silicon Valley investable space, or is it really the same things that make it investable?
I'd say a lot of it is the same things. The old saw is you have the technology, the people in the market, and investors are looking for all those things. There are some investors that are a lot more sophisticated about open source business models than others. So one of the things to consider is maybe you want to go to investors who have invested in open source businesses before, so you don't have the heavy lift of explaining the underpants noun thing to them. But for me, making decisions about what companies I put my money into and that my VC funds have put money into, that is about, first of all, good technology. The technology develops rapidly over time, and so there's a lot of opportunities to improve it. Product market fit is very, very important. In the last venture fund I was in, we used to say, find the product that everybody uses and everybody hates, and code up an alternative to that. And that actually works quite well. That's called product market fit, right? Or something new that you think people are going to need to use. And then the people are very important. A successful founder is going to be someone who wants to build a big business. I mean, this is for investors, right? Someone who wants to build a big business that will go outside of their sphere of control, right? Because one thing about building a big business is you might maintain control over it in certain ways, but it becomes something, there are a lot of people working there, and you're not going to be able to micromanage everything. And so when I'm talking to founders, I'm looking to see, is this the kind of person who believes in building a big business? Like if a founder comes to me and says, I can build this business because I'm going to get all these grants from government, I'm like, that's great, but that's not going to make a business for you. That's going to make a nice project that has government grants, right? Because that means that their mindset is that they don't need to make money. Also, they have to be just kind of excited about the possibility of being prosperous and creating jobs for people and creating great products. And certain people are more just, technologists, and they don't care so much about that stuff. And certain people really care about those things, and those are obviously qualities that you look for in a founder. And then just also, a good founder is extremely nimble, able to deal with changing circumstances, able to pivot, has a lot of resiliency, doesn't have personal issues that are going to make them burn out, right? Those things are all important too. So technology, product, market fit, and people but that's what you would hear probably from any Silicon Valley investor. I would add for open source, they can't be the underpants gnomes.
I'd now like to ask for questions from the audience.
So outside of those 3 licenses, I've also seen some pushes of people embargoing changes in their source code, saying if you want the latest stuff, you'll have to pay us. I've seen people like Fuse, where they went through and they went out under a very permissive license and then very quietly kept releasing updates without source until at one point they went private. And what have you seen in effective alternate licenses?
Yeah, so, well, first let's talk about those 2 situations. So embargo is one model for open source, and some people would say it's not really open source because in order to embargo, you can't develop in the open. So, and for those of you who may not know, it's like there's one way where you just kind of let it all hang out and everybody contributes from day one, basically. And then there are other models where you stage releases and you're developing a lot of stuff in private. Commercial open source projects range along that line from one end of the spectrum to the other, but there's a business model where you release code early on to people who are paying for it, and then you release it publicly to people who to the community. And probably the poster child for this model, at least historically, was the Android operating system, right? Where you had to pay a lot of money to get an early release access because that was provided to people who were making mobile devices and they had a lot of money and they have a very short go-to-market cycle. So that is a legitimate business model, but it is not developing in the open. So that happens. I would not say it's really, really common. Most commercial open source companies will develop some stuff in private, but it's going to tend to be more niche stuff or enterprise features that they're never going to release under an open source license. The other thing that you mentioned is companies starting under a permissive license and then moving more and more of their development into non-open source licenses. And that you see more commonly. It happens when people pick a permissive license and then they realize that they cannot sustain a business based on a permissive license. Or it happens, to be honest, when you have investors come in later who don't understand an open source business model and start saying, you got to close this stuff up and get rid of all these freeloaders so we can make some money. You know, that is the opposite of like knowing how these models work. So that definitely happens too. I think the right way to do it is, let's say you're doing an open core model, and you have something that's open source, and then you have some features that you sell. They're not open source. The features that you sell are normally what we call enterprise features, which are features that enable large users to use the software at scale. And they range from things like connectors to other software, things that you can do to monitor performance, security, some kinds of security features, all sorts of things like that. But the way to do it right is to make sure that the open source core still works for people who are not in big enterprises. And if you get that wrong, then you get all sorts of backlash from the community, and rightfully so, because what you're doing is you're kind of starving them of the resources. You want to make sure that your community edition and your enterprise edition are both viable products, because the objective of a commercial open source business is not to convert every open source user to a customer. The objective is to convert certain kinds of users to customers, and they tend to be the biggest users. And that is really the art in managing one of these projects, and the best founders are very, very good at this.
I'll be Michaelis. No problem. Well, thank you, and this Chinstrap community and your book sound incredibly interesting. I think the digging deeper in the question I had was more about contractual mechanism of licensing an open source project to venture. Some of the issues that we've seen or that we've been played around, number one is kind of licensing the rights of authorship in the project itself. But also kind of controlling this new code, like it's like operational agreements, maybe making a B Corp, so they have some sort of they're kind of tethered to this open source community that is saying that, hey, we kind of need this to remain open source, you need to promise us that at least the core will remain open. So those are kind of the two mechanisms that we played with, and I'm curious, kind of, how did you do it since you've been at Venture and kind of started new codes with open source companies?
Yeah, just to kind of fill in a little extra context on this, some companies that are commercial open source companies, particularly open core companies, will have their core project with a public foundation. So that would be a nonprofit foundation like Apache, like Linux, or like a special purpose foundation. They could also be in a B Corp, which is a special kind of company. By the way, people use that term in different ways, but it's a company whose primarily goal is not entirely to make money. Like a regular company, the goal of a corporation is to make money, right? A B Corp has a different set of goals that are more attuned towards social good, okay? And there's an entity that does certification of B Corps, but there are also public benefit corporations, which are types of corporations you can create in the law of various states. And those are not quite the same thing, but they kind of serve the same purpose. So the overarching question, I think, is do you need a different corporate structure in order to make sure that the open source project is really run for the benefit of the community as opposed to just milking the community for money? And I've seen it done successfully both ways, both with a foundation and without. If you go with a foundation, you actually have significant additional branding issues, because if you go with something like Linux Foundation or Apache Foundation, they will actually take your brand from you and want to own it. So that means you usually have to rebrand your commercial product. And if you're doing that later in your corporate life cycle, that can be painful. And I've been involved in a lot of cases where, people just had a lot of trouble with that. The other way to do it is just run out of a regular C Corp, but you could make a pledge to the community about how you're going to maintain the project, or you just earn the community's trust. And if you look at a lot of the successful open source businesses, they actually just do the latter. Like, the community trusts the management of the company. And then problems tend to result when the ownership of the company changes. And not to dump on private equity, although I love dumping on private equity, is private equity investors will come in late in the life cycle of a company, and particularly one that's making a lot of money, cash, and they'll just kind of squeeze it for the amount of cash that they can get out of it. And so when you have those people in the boardroom, they're the ones who are espousing decisions that will probably make the community lose faith in management. And I think you saw this with things like HashiCorp and to some degree Redis maybe, where the community had a negative reaction to the changes that they were making in their business. But it is extremely important to maintain the confidence of the community. And the companies that do that well do it really well, and not necessarily because they have the code in a foundation. It's just that they're maintaining control of the company, and they are focusing on the community as an asset of the business as opposed to a cost of the business, which is what some kinds of investors tend to do.
Hello, I'm Edwin Espinoza. I'm from Cal Poly Humboldt. I work in IT on that campus in the CSU system. And my question is sometimes open source technology is built on a lot of other open source technology. Is that a significant risk if a project decides to go with a different license, or what are the risks you've seen there with kind of this combination of open source projects?
Thanks for the question. So everything contains a lot of open source software these days, whether your product is proprietary, open source, whatever. And it is a very bad idea to put out a product that has license conflicts built into it. So when you release your project, you want to make sure that it works with all the licenses for the dependencies of the project. You could do otherwise, but you will be creating a very difficult situation, either for yourself or for yourself and your community. So you don't want to, for instance, it's getting a little into the weeds, but there are licenses like the General Public License, a Faro General Public License, and they are for whole programs. So if you release code under one of those licenses, but your software is a library, then you create a situation where people can't build compliant products. And I don't suggest doing that, because while you may make some money getting people to pay you for alternative licenses, it's not a great business model. And there are a lot of companies out there doing this. If you've ever run into Qt and MySQL, and so forth. Like these are products that have kind of a license compliance landmine built into them. And I don't suggest that as a business model. It's not an illegal business model. It's just not one I would invest in, right? Because I prefer to see companies that are going to have a viable community edition and a viable enterprise edition. So answer to your question, yes, you need to make sure you're getting all of the dependencies right, and that the license you choose is going to not conflict with the license for any dependencies. And that can be some work, but it's not rocket science. It's something that at this point is it's well known how to do that.
This is going to be the last question. Ask shortly, because the timekeeper's telling me we're done.
Okay, so shifting to maybe from not illegal, but maybe unethical things that are happening right now. We talked a lot about licenses, and I wonder, I think it's a risk to do open source as a business at this moment, because it's so easy for all these models that do code generation to ingest your whatever license code you use and then disregard it, because basically these are like license laundering machines is what they are. So how do you see that risk, and how's that playing out?
So I think what you're talking about is machine learning models like producing code, and how that, because the machine learning models don't reproduce license notice or pass down any license terms. So why is it not the case that anybody can just use any software they like and pay and disregard your open source license? And I think the answer is the same, that the machine learning models, at least at this point in time, they can produce some really great code, but they don't produce products. Okay, so I've used them, and it's pretty amazing what some of them can do, but I would not use that code without human intervention. And so if a person is deciding to adopt some software and their choice is, I'm going to tell an AI model what to write for me and then run it, or I'm going to buy a license from this other company or something, then most people will still choose the latter because the quality control is there. We may get to the point where AI code generation has a high level of quality control, but we are not there yet. So if you're using AI models to generate code, you can get some really great stuff, but again, that is more like a tool and less like a product. And the idea of building a commercial enterprise is that you've got a brand that people trust. And the brand of AI is not one people trust right now. So I see we're out of time. I just wanted to say that I'll be around for quite a while, so I'm happy to chat with anybody about questions they may have later on.
Okay.